I guess that's our cue to get moving. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the DA Special Populations presentation. It's great to see everyone. I hope that everyone is well and staying safe. My name is Abe Christ from the Performance Office. Yes, hello. This is our last presentation this week of our summative assessments this spring, and we're focusing on our special populations in the next hour or so. This session is being recorded, so please be mindful of that fact, and it will be posted likely early next week along with the PDFs, the PowerPoint presentation that will be available. I know my colleagues have already uploaded the PDF of the presentation into the chat today. So if you can access the chat, that's going to be your friend throughout the presentation. If you're not a frequent Teams user, you will find the presentation in a PDF format there. There will be several opportunities to ask questions during the meeting. You can use the chat, put your question into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer it there. If we can't get to it during the meeting, we might wait till a pause and then answer it verbally. We will, and you'll be able to do that using the raise hand feature, and we'll take you off mute and you can actually state your question. So a couple things to make today's next hour a success. As I just mentioned, all attendees are on mute, and you will be on mute for the duration of the webinar unless you raise your hand to ask a question. We will answer the questions at the breaks, as I mentioned too. Also, if you didn't catch it at the beginning, and if you're sort of panicking, getting used to the venue here, if you're missing anything, we are going to be recording and posting this next week along with the PowerPoint. Okay, and I'm joined here today by my awesome colleagues in the Performance Office, Deirdre Ducharme and Janet Stuck. They're on the webinar here. Their contact information is here. If you are a new coordinator, this slide is probably the most important slide of this deck right now, because Janet and Deirdre are your best friend when it comes to special populations issues. One thing to mention about that, there's always a caveat, is Janet on April 1st, this is not an April Fool's joke too, is retiring. Congratulations, Janet. And so if you have any questions after April 1st, make sure to go to Deirdre, or you can go to me. You can go to any of our other team members in the office. Congratulations, Janet. And I know Janet is going to have a couple words in a few minutes here too. So we'll turn it over to her in this moment. Also on the call today is Christy Alberino. Christy is out there somewhere. I see her waving. She is handling many of the appeals, a lot of the policy questions that come up during the administration. So here's Christy's contact information as well. Also on the call today is our awesome teammates from Cambium, Jen Cho, and I know Marie Musumeci is also here today. Here is their contact information, their phone number, their email. They're terrific. We've been partnering with them for years. So if you have more CAI related questions, here's their contact info. Okay, I am going to hand it over to the special populations experts. Janet is going to start us off on the presentation, and I think she's out there. Janet, I'm going to hand the baton to you.
Thank you, Abe. So I wanted to welcome you all and thank you all for your hard work over the years. I have appreciated working with you. So in our presentation today, fortunately, a lot of things have not changed. So this should be a good overview. So we will be talking about our calendar of dates, our participation expectations, students who are eligible for supports and accommodations, things that are actually new for this year, some particular reminders we want you to be aware of, our special documented accommodations process, the alternate assessment system, and medical exemptions, And as Abe mentioned, we are going to provide opportunities for you to ask questions throughout the session. Next slide, please. So we have special dates to keep in mind in terms of various functions related to your students who we consider special populations. These would include those students who are general education, who need designated supports within the testing system, your English learners, your students with disabilities, whether they're indicated with an IEP or a 504 plan. So between November 19th and June 3rd, these students have to be entered into TIDE, indicating any supports or accommodations that will be provided for them. And we want you to make sure that you do it before they are tested. We also have an opportunity for you to request special documented accommodations, which we'll talk about, and those are due by March 1st. And for those of you that are new to the DA role, this is something that you would work with your staff to ensure that any student who requires these, you would initiate this process by calling either Deidre or myself. And then we also have, in the very rare case where a student needs a medical exemption, this means the student is not available for testing through the entire testing window, and you can reach out again to Deidre or myself related to these rare situations. Next slide, please. So like in previous years, we are conducting office hours. So these are sessions that allow you to touch base with us and ask questions in a timely manner. So we have already scheduled 2 of them for February 17th and March 17th. And these are topic specific related to special populations. Generally, the way the office hours work is we have topics that we think are important for you to attend to at that time. They may be generated by situations in the field or questions we've had repeated. So this allows us to present those to you, and then we open it up for your questions. And beginning March 31st, every Thursday at 3, we will be conducting these, and these are related to SmarterBalance, NGSS, CTOS, and CTAA. And I do want to make you aware that there are also similar office hours for our other programs, such as the Lost Links and SAT. Next slide, please. So we often get questions about, well, who is supposed to participate in summative assessments? So all students who are registered in the Public School Information System, the PSIS, are expected to test on summative assessments. So it's very important that you keep an open communication with your PSIS coordinator, your special education staff, your English learner staff, to ensure that all students are represented appropriately in the PSIS system, so that ultimately they become available in the TIDE and testing system for testing and are reflected appropriately, particularly in the correct grade. And those of you that attended the DA workshop, you cannot change students' demographic information in TIDE. All of that is driven by the PSIS system. So if it's right in PSIS, it will be uploaded into the TIDE system on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the supports and accommodations for your students. We want to provide equitable access to the assessment for your students. So let's take a look at the next slide. So we have tiered supports and accommodations within our testing system. So who is eligible for universal tools? So universal tools are those supports in the system, and they come in 2 flavors, embedded and non-embedded. And these are available for all students who are accessing the assessments. These are typically those that you see in regular computer use, digital notepad, highlighters, things that the students are often familiar with as they're working in instruction. We do want to encourage you to provide opportunities for students to access the practice tests, because this allows them to decrease their anxiety about what's coming in assessments, and also access the tools and where to find them in the system, so they're very familiar with this. Next slide, please. Our next tier is designated supports. So this is a little more restrictive. These are supports for any student for whom the need has been indicated by an educator, parent, guardian, and we include student here because it's very important to make sure that you have conversations and discussions with the student about their testing experience before and after, because they have to buy into what supports are being provided. For example, students who are in middle school do not want to look different than their peers. So you may want to have that discussion about, well, you know, this support really supports you in instruction, so we want to do it in our assessment as well. And this is particularly true if students are tested in smaller groups or individually. So you want to keep those in mind as you're choosing these designated supports for your students. We encourage districts to create a method to track these and ensure that they're discussed annually, just like we would accommodations. And again, it's critical to try the practice tests. Next slide, please. So accommodations are our most restrictive tier in terms of supporting our students. Accommodations within the testing system are only available for students with an active IEP or Section 504 plan. So these students would have decisions made at their PPT or their 504 plan meeting to determine what accommodations are appropriate, and typically they would be the same ones used during instruction. These are activated in TIDE to provide them access in testing. These can also be tried in the practice test. And these come in two different flavors as well: embedded, which means they're delivered right through the testing system, or non-embedded, which means that the district or test proctor would provide that accommodation in the testing session. And as we mentioned in the DA workshop, if your student needs things like large print test booklets, those are things that are non-embedded and would be ordered through the system and determined prior to testing. Next slide, please. So in the demographic area of each student's profile, you can see if they have IDEA indicator indicated as yes, or Section 504 as yes. These are embedded from the PSIS system. So if for some reason you cannot enter accommodations for a student that you know has an IEP, it may be because they're not indicated appropriately in the PSIS system. So in order to enter accommodations for a student, these must be indicated as yes or 504 yes. Next slide, please. So this is one of the tools that we have provided for you, and it's available on the CAI portal. It is called the Accessibility Chart, and you can find it when you go to resources and enter that in the search bar as well. So again, this is a graphic representation of what I indicated earlier, the differences between the universal tools, the designated supports, and accommodations. So this is a really good tool to have available to you at your PPT meetings or your 504 meetings to ensure that you are taking advantage of the supports and accommodations the students need for testing and instruction for that matter. Within this chart, you'll see additional information about those accommodations that are available as a special documented accommodation, which we'll talk about soon. Next slide, please. So within the practice and training tests, which we mentioned, you want to make sure that you're giving opportunities for your students to access these. They can sign in as a guest user, which your parents can also see this as well. If a student signs in with their SACID, and that's the state assigned student identification number, 10 digits, for those of you that are new, the students' accommodations that are already indicated in TIDE, maybe they took an interim or something like that, those accommodations would appear within the practice site. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn this over to Deirdre shortly to discuss some things that are new for 22. And this is a kind of a natural break point. Are there questions that I think my colleagues have been responding to those in the chat, but if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we can work to unmute you so you can ask your question directly.
Janet, it appears that all the questions in the chat have been addressed, so those are good. So I would suggest that if anybody else has a question, you can either drop it in the chat or use the raise hand feature.
Okay, thank you. And
actually,
Deirdre?
one just came in. We'll honor that question. I can answer it, but I'll let you guys who are the experts. How do we enter designated supports for students? Is the question.
Do you want me to take that, Janet?
Okay, so I also see a follow-up question about what TIDE is. And I apologize, this is one of my pet peeves about acronyms. I should have clarified. TIDE is the Testing Information Distribution Engine. Thank you. And that's where all the testing accommodations are entered. So we have a TIDE user manual that can walk you through that process.
It's dropped in the chat too, Janet.
Okay, so we have resources available on the portal to help guide you in entering that, and has screenshots so that you should be able to do that. And of course, we're available for you to call as needed. Thank you. All right, Deirdre, you're on.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you this afternoon. And sorry we're not together in person, but it's still nice to see your faces on the other end. I'm going to walk you through some updates related to 2022. And the good news is that there are very few changes in the year ahead. So you can rest assured, given all the minute-to-minute changes that you're used to addressing at work and in your schools, you can know that in the test administration window ahead, there are very few changes that you have to deal with. Next screen. So with that said, the one change I would like to bring to your attention is we've modified the procedure for submitting the decision guidelines for text-to-speech of the Smarter Balanced ELA reading passages. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this particular form, for students that are eligible to have text-to-speech of the reading passages, we have a form that helps guide that screening process. And historically, our schools submitted that form to our office. It would provide us with characteristics of the students using this accommodation. So effective this year and in moving forward, you're still going to use the decision guidelines as a screening tool. You'll complete it, you'll file and maintain the form locally, but you'll no longer submit the form to our office. As far as students that you think are eligible for human reader accommodation, you will complete the documented evidence for read aloud of the Smarter Balance passages. You can use that form as a screening tool. And if your student meets the qualifications, you'll work with your district administrator to complete a petition for special documented accommodations. And this documented evidence form will be used as evidence when submitting your petition. And I'll share a little bit more information about the special documented process later in this presentation. If you're wondering where to access these two forms, the decision guidelines and documented evidence form, you can access them on the portal. We have a fully dedicated page called the Guidelines for Choosing Text-to-Speech or Read Aloud. And on this form, we have resources developed or published by Smarter Balance that defines the process and describes the eligibility. So if you need more information, certainly reach out to the portal or give us a call. Next slide, please. Going to take a moment to go through some reminders related to the universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations that are available to our students. And this will hopefully guide your teachers as they establish practice test opportunities for their students. It will give teachers an opportunity to really pinpoint how students can activate these tools and use them with confidence prior to test administration. Next slide. So for the Smarter Balanced mathematics assessments in grades 6 through 8, we have math calculator segments, if you will, in which students will have access to an embedded Desmos calculator. We also provide the Desmos tool for students taking the science assessment in grades 8 and 11, although there are no science items that are dependent on the use of a calculator. But specifically related to the Desmos calculator, we want to make sure that kids are familiar with how to use it. And there are some benefits specifically to Desmos as it pertains to its accessibility supports for students with specific needs, especially children who have visual disabilities or perhaps are using refreshable Braille to access the assessment. The Desmos calculator does provide some embedded benefits for those students so that they can access the graphs and equations, etc. The Desmos calculator is built with universal design in mind. The Desmos calculator provides features that support students who use screen readers. The calculators provide support for students who have low vision, students who have difficulty with perceptual skills. And the calculators allow students to adjust font size if they prefer a larger print. So what we've included on this slide is a link to the Smarter Balance sample items website. This is a tool that your teachers can use with their students to practice using Desmos with some of the math items, and it will help prepare students for taking these assessments. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. As a reminder, we offer a variety of reader supports for our students to access the Smarter Balanced assessments as well as Next Generation Science. Text-to-speech is a reader option for students that use text-to-speech regularly during instruction. We offer text-to-speech of test items as a designated support. So this is not a universal tool, but for those students that do require support in accessing the text, we have this as a designated support for test items. You'll activate this text-to-speech in the TIDE system. Next slide. Text-to-speech may also be used as an accommodation for students with visual or print disabilities. So as a reminder, the Smarter Balance reading assessment measures a student's ability to read and comprehend complex text. We evaluate a student's ability to interpret and analyze text. So in an effort to not compromise those important reading constructs, we want to make sure that that students who are eligible for text-to-speech of reading passages use that particular accommodation Otherwise, for students that use this accommodation for other purposes, it may compromise what we're actually trying to measure. And the information that we yield based on the student's performance may be biased based on the student using accommodation that he or she was not eligible for. So again, we have a decision guideline form that should be used if you think you have a student that qualifies for text-to-speech of the reading passages. Use this form as a screener. And if you find that your student does qualify, when you log on to the student's TIDE dashboard, you'll activate you'll activate passages and items to activate that accommodation for the student. Next slide. We offer text-to-speech in Spanish for our literate Spanish speakers on the Next Generation Science Assessment. This particular slide articulates the different fields that you would select to activate the Spanish text-to-speech, but essentially you'll want to change the student's presentation to Spanish toggle, and you'll want to activate text-to-speech. And this allows the student to be able to see a full presentation of their science assessment in Spanish, and then they can toggle back to English if appropriate. Next slide. When your teachers set up a practice opportunity for their students, make sure that they show their students how to use the tool icon to adjust the text-to-speech volume, pitch, and rate, and also showed students how to activate the text-to-speech icon for each of the corresponding items. So this particular slide does show the tools that your students should look for to activate the text-to-speech. So we have a taskbar. You'll notice the circle with the 3 horizontal lines. When students click down on the drop-down menu, they'll see an option to speak the question. Students will use this command each time they need an item read, or if they need to activate the reading of the reading passages. Next slide. We offer speech-to-text as an embedded accommodation for students that require support for their written expression. This accommodation allows students to orally dictate their responses to smarter balanced open-ended items. So if you have students that use speech-to-text, it is an accommodation for the math performance tasks or any of the open-ended items that might be associated with smarter balanced ELA. We do not offer open-ended items on science. So even if you have students that qualify for this accommodation, it's not applicable on the science assessment. Like all accommodations, like all embedded accommodations, the speech-to-text will be activated in the student's TIDE account, and students will be prompted to conduct a functionality of their microphone check when they first log onto the secure browser. So this allows them to make sure that the speech-to-text and the microphone work accordingly. Next slide. Just want to note that when students use text-to-speech, this particular functionality does provide automatic capitalization and punctuation. We also want to ensure that students have an opportunity to double check their dictation that's recorded into the speech-to-text, into the student's response option box. So students can go back and modify, revise their responses as many times as necessary before they move on to the next test item. But we do request that kids double check their work and make sure that they're satisfied with their response before they move on to the next item. Next slide. Great. We did have a couple questions in the chat box regarding supports for our English learners. So I just want to take a moment to highlight the translation glossary for mathematics. This is a designated support available for students who speak other languages. We offer about, I think, between 13 and 15 native languages for this particular designated support. And it's evolved over the years. So at one point in time, we had an option for the student to either receive a translation of their native language paired up with an English glossary. But now we have multiple selection features, so students can also use dual language supports as well as that of an illustration glossary if they're not as fluent in their native language, or if the student's native language is not reflected as an option for this particular designated support. We've included a snippet of what students will see for the translation glossary, and a dotted line will appear above and below any of the non-construct relevant vocabulary math terms. So students should look out for those dotted lines. When they hover their mouse over the word, they will have access to the translation, again, either in their native language and or English. You'll also see there's an audio icon. So if the student selects that, they'll be able to hear the audio version of the translation. Next slide. And we've included the comparable version for students who use Illustration Glossary. And while Illustration Glossary may be a useful tool for our English learners, this also might be a great tool for students who have other language or communication disabilities. So try it out with your students on a practice test first. If you think that this might be a beneficial tool, make sure that the students know how to use it. And if it seems like it's an appropriate support, then certainly encourage them, set it up in Tide, and then encourage them to use this tool when they're taking their assessments. We've included a link as well. Smarter Balanced is published an illustration glossary resource for mathematics, and it's a great tool if you're looking to learn more about this support. Next slide. If you have students that cannot access the next generation science assessments or Smarter Balanced on a digital platform, we do provide Braille test booklets as well as large print test booklets. The district administrator has access to ordering these materials through the Tide system. District administrators can order these materials on or after January 25th. You want to make sure that you first activate the non-embedded accommodation for Braille or large print test materials first, and then you can use Tide to go through the various steps in ordering those materials. Next slide. We've identified the 3 steps for ordering paper materials in Tide, and our district administrators can use the Tide system to track and follow the shipment of these materials. Next slide. If you have students that require accommodations that go above and beyond the standard accommodations for testing, such as the provision of a human reader for all assessments, including the reading passages, or a student who may need the use of a human signer or visual supports, a scribe, etc. While these are considered non-standard accommodations, we certainly want to make sure your students have access to the accessibility supports that they need. So we have a special documented accommodation petition that can be completed locally by your teacher, by the PPT, and other educators. And essentially what it does is it allows you to document what the student's specific needs are. The district administrator will submit that information to our office along with a copy of the student's IEP or 504 plan, or if there's additional documentation to support the request of the accommodation. And our office will work with you to make sure that there's, aside of the evidence that you supply, that we have everything in place so that your student can access the assessment within the parameters of test policies and procedures. Next slide. What we recommend is that if you have a student that you think qualifies, or you know that a student qualifies for one of these accommodations, please contact either me or Janet. We ask that if you email us that you don't include student confidential information such as the first and last name. Please do not email us IEP or 504 plans. Rather, any secure information that you have can be shared with us through this Cambian Secure FTP site. And we will work with you to make sure that you have access and that we have an appropriate means of collecting the petition and other important documentation. We will also use the secure Cambian FTP site to release approval letters or any other information that your teachers may need in order to provide these accommodations appropriately to their students at the time of testing. And if you have any questions along the way, always give our office a call and we'll make sure that we can provide you with the supports and resources that you need. Next slide. All right, I'm going to pass the baton back to Janet, and she's going to walk you through the alternate assessments. Thank you.
Thanks, Dee. So we only have about half an hour left, so I want to make sure that you realize that we are going to respond to your questions either in the chat or at the end of the session, but I'm going to hold off on taking a break here for questions to make sure that we get through the rest of the content. So at this point, we want to share some information about our alternate assessment system, and this is designed for students with significant cognitive disability. Next slide, please. So students who have significant cognitive disabilities would have evidence in their IEPs, and if they meet the criteria to participate in an alternate assessment, the PPT team would determine that based on the alternate assessment eligibility form. This form is submitted by the trained teacher into the data entry interface, which registers that student to participate in the alternate assessment system. If a student is participating in the alternate assessment system, they do not participate in Smarter Balanced, NGSS, or the SAT, or for those who are English learners, they would not participate in the Lost Links. So this year, the alternate assessment eligibility form is essentially the same, but we did add a question here. Is the student identified as an English learner in the public school information system? We did this to ensure that there's clear communication between all students, staff that support a student who may be an English learner and who may also have disabilities and significant cognitive disabilities, because we want to make sure that there's clear communication so that students are added to the appropriate testing rosters. So that's the new question. And next slide, please. The other enhancement we did was we added drop-down menus for the required tests used to determine cognitive disability and adaptive skill disability. So, and these are not tests that Deirdre and I just picked out of a hat. These are tests that are used in Connecticut, and we worked closely with the community of practice of school psychologists to determine if these are tests that are appropriate for this purpose of determining eligibility for this assessment. So these are the cognitive assessments that should be used to determine this when you have your triennials for your students being considered for an alternate. Next slide, please. So similarly, we have adaptive skills that we have defined the assessments for as well. And remember that students participating in an alternate need to have adaptive skill assessments represented. There's other ways to show evidence of the cognitive disability, but the adaptive skills is a critical component in determining eligibility for these students. Next slide, please. So within on the CAI portal, we have several resources for you, which include the annotated version of the alternate assessment eligibility form so that you can see clearly the questions that you might ask about sections of the form. But you can see here on the form that there are notes related to the completion of the verification page. So if the student does not qualify as determined at the PPT for the alternate assessment, the expectation is that the standard assessment would be selected and appropriate supports and accommodations for that student would be determined at that time and ultimately entered into the TIDE system. Next slide. So these are resources that we've developed specifically for the alternate assessment system. And there are also forms for parents to review to understand what this assessment is and how it supports their child. Next slide, please. So in terms of the alternate assessment calendar, we want to make sure that you are determining this at the PPT. And we recognize that PPTs happen all throughout the year, but you want to make sure that you're discussing this prior to testing and that students submit the form by March 1st. This is critical in terms of the alternate assessment eligibility flag, which we'll talk about in a moment. So you can see that the alternate assessment for English Language Arts and Math, the CTAA, is submitted and administered through March 28th through June 3rd, and it is an online test delivery, and the trained teacher would be delivering that individually to the student. The Connecticut alternate science assessment is a little different. That is similar to performance tasks. It is not secure. It is not delivered online. Teachers can be administering components of that throughout the year, but the final upload of that information is due between March 28th and June 3rd, and that is submitted into the data entry interface. Next slide, please. So these are the various components comparing the two alternate assessments. You'll see that the English Language Arts and Math is the CTAA, and the alternate science is referred to as the CTAS. And you'll see that the CTAS is given in grades 5, 8, and 11, which parallels our science standard assessment, the grades that's administered. And you'll see here the test delivery system method and whether it's secure or not. Next slide, please. So the description of our science assessment is like I said, a performance-based assessment. Students are administered the tasks throughout the year, and then the teacher submits the scores during the testing window. There are required materials for this assessment. You'll see the link on the slide. Next slide, please. And you'll see that these scores are submitted into the data entry interface. These are the same trained teachers that we expect to have access to the data entry interface because they have completed their alternate assessment training. The components of the CTAS include the performance tasks themselves, the scripted directions for the teacher, and resource packets, which include the actual item and it's a visual representation. These are available online for printing. The hard copy of these were sent to districts in 2018, and the expectation was that they would be shared year to year between district schools. And then, of course, the student score worksheet. And all of these are online, and they're broken down by grade. Next slide, please. So the importance of the data entry interface is certainly related to the alternate assessment in terms of submitting the eligibility form and the scores for science. But there are other purposes as well. So you want to make sure that those individuals who need to submit these have access to the data entry interface. Next slide, please. So like the TIDE system, the data entry interface is accessible through the CEI portal. And as one of the components is returning the large print and braille materials. We want to make sure that those are submitted, but the paper copies are actually returned to our support vendor called Measurement Incorporated. When you receive those materials, those instructions are included with the documents. Just keep in mind our time here. One of the things that Deidre and I continue to get questions on is about the training and for our teachers who are administering the alternate assessment. So as a district administrator, it's important for you to know who the teachers are who will be administering the alternate assessment system to their students. Those students need to be tested individually, and the teachers must be trained annually. And the reason we do it annually is because there are nuances that are changed each year. So those teachers must be designated with the user role of TEA. And just so you know, the TEA role is exactly the same as the teacher role, but it includes the additional component of being able to administer the alternate and access the secure areas related to the alternate assessment system. So if you have a teacher who is administering both the alternate and the standard assessments, they can have just the TEA role and that will suffice. TEA's training involves completing 4 online modules. They're ranging from 30 to 40 minutes each or less. And then they follow it with a quiz. The teachers need to obtain a score of 80% or better on the quiz in order to be certified to administer the alternate and submit into the data entry interface. If a teacher has difficulty with achieving the 80%, they can take the entire quiz again. Next slide. So these are specific resources we've established to support you in accessing the alternate assessment system. So as a district administrator, the first document you see there is an overview for district administrators to ensure that you complete each step related to the alternate assessment. And then there's a similar document for teachers administering the alternate assessment on the expectations for them. Additional documents include the test administration manuals and the user guide. And for students who are participating in the alternate assessment system, who happen to be blind, deaf, or deafblind, we have an additional resource to support you in administering those assessments with some guidelines. Next slide, please. So as a district administrator, this function of confirming the teacher trained status will be very helpful because you want to periodically check in here and make sure that those teachers have the TEA role and are certified to administer the alternate to ensure that the students who are taking the alternate can fulfill their participation. Next slide, please. In a similar manner, if you go into the administering tests section, you can monitor test submissions as well to ensure that the alternate assessment eligibility has been submitted, as well as if the test has been completed. Next slide, please. One of the advantages of the TEA role and the trained teacher is that they can access the secure alternate assessment materials, which are required to administer the assessment. Essentially, these are the scripts or directions for test administration for each of the assessments by grade and subject, as well as a PDF of the test itself for those students who cannot access it online and would require a paper document to refer to, Or for example, if you have a student using an eye gaze board, they can access it. The teacher can manipulate the document and provide the responses on the eye gaze board. Next slide, please. Okay. I'm looking at our time, and I'm want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm sorry if I'm rushing. So one of the establishments we have for the alternate assessment system is the early stopping rule. So some students do not have an established communication mode. If that's the case for your student, then they do not have to complete the entire test without being able to respond. You would call either Deidre or myself, and we would work you through the early stopping rule system. There is a flow chart available on the alternate assessment system section of the CAI portal, so you can refer to that for the steps related to the early stopping rule. Next slide, please. So one of the things that in some situations, although rare, we have a medical exemption procedure. So if for some reason a student is unable to participate in testing because they're not available for education for the entire test window, there is a medical exemption procedure. So you can contact either Deidre or myself, and we can walk you through that process to ensure your student can be considered medically exempt. And these are also referenced in the assessment guidelines. Keep in mind, it does require a doctor's signature. Okay, all right. I feel like I missed mentioning about the alternate assessment indicator flag. So I want to make sure that when your students are submitted into the DEI to take the alternate assessment, there is a flag in the demographic area that indicates whether the student is identified for the alternate. So you can monitor that to make sure you have an appropriate list of those students who should be participating in the alternate. And those are set weekly by our colleagues at CAI. So if you don't see it right now, check again in a few days if you know that the form was submitted into the data entry interface. Okay, I think I see some hands raised.
Janet, I'm going to unmute Natalie so that she can. Natalie, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. My question goes back to the text-to-speech for reader of passages. I just want to clarify because our district was one that was trying to give it out too liberally. So we had a special meeting in December and said, you cannot do this. So we no longer have to do a petition for the computer to do reader of passages, but it should still be less than 1% of the students, and it should be for the print disabilities. We don't have any visual disability students at this time. And then we have to turn on reader of passages in the text to speech, but can that be done at the school level, or is it controlled at the district level? Because you guys had to turn it on last year.
So if you have again, the best practice is to make sure that you're very clear in the IEP of what kind of reader the student needs. First off, you want to have, if a student requires a reader, typically for a print disability or a visual disability, you want to indicate that the student needs a reader of items and stimuli or passages. If the student needs passages, then you need to say, do they require text to speech or a human reader? Those are two different scenarios. So you want to make sure that's clearly in the IEP. So you don't want to over-identify, like you said, Natalie. Right. And especially you want to consider if a student's in third grade, do you want to provide that or do you want to get a baseline? So text, we don't set a percentage. You have to work that through at your district level.
Okay.
So for text to speech, reading passages, that does not require a petition for special documented accommodations. It does not require any submission to us. At the district level, there is the decision guidelines that help support you make that decision about your students. We also have on our website an options table, a reader options table that describes the different expectations for each of the reader scenarios.
Yeah. So
Did I answer?
we've done those pieces and we've identified 4 students in our district, but I turn it on in Tide or they turn it on in Tide? The
No.
school coordinator can?
So individuals with the permissions for user role to enter the accommodations within the Tide test setting, and Jen, please correct me if I'm wrong, but at the district level, you would turn on the reader passages or as text to speech.
Right,
If
so
you
just
have-
to clarify, under the text-to-speech value in Tide, you will turn for ELA, you're going to select passages and items, and then, you know, you would select stimuli and items for the other subtest. The only fields in Tide that are activated at the state level are those related to a human reader, a scribe, medical device. I think that may be it at this point in time. And those are those type of accommodations that require a petition. Otherwise, all other designated supports and accommodations can be set by the test coordinator, the DA, the school coordinator.
So the schools can start to turn this on and I wouldn't know that they haven't filled out the paperwork or gone through the assistant superintendent for SPED.
That is true. So
Okay.
I guess at this point, it will really be at the discretion of the LEA to determine what that process is and to ensure that for those students who are eligible for text-to-speech of passages, that the form is completed and that the correct students are using this accommodation.
Okay, that's a change too, that they'll be able to turn that on, which is fine. I can do a search and find out who turned it on. You know what I mean? I can do a search in Tide by accommodations. I just need to make sure to do that as we do the additional training. But thank you. It's nice not to have to go through the whole petition process. I do appreciate that. And I appreciate the time.
Sure. Thanks, Natalie.
Absolutely, you're welcome.
Any other questions?
You do
So,
have a few unanswered questions in the chat.
Okay.
Janet, Janet, I've been trying to keep in, I think for the most part, there's a couple that have trickled in just lately,
Okay.
but I think cheers to everybody that's responding to the chat because it's been a spirited discussion here. So, but there's a couple questions that just came in for students that are outplaced who completes the eligibility form, the district or the facility.
Okay. So our policy has always been, or practice actually, has always been that for students who are outplaced or in, for example, like approved private special education facilities, the documentation is completed closest to where the student is sitting or educated. But because the sending district or reporting district manages that IEP, we expect that there's a lot of collaboration and communication there. So and that's determined at the PPT, which we would hope that the sending district is attending and running. So all of the players should be at the table discussing it. So ultimately, the teacher who will be administering it at, for example, the private approved, would complete the form and submit it into the data entry interface with the understanding that it is blessed or understood by the sending district.
Janet, there's a question about designated supports. And just to be clear, designated supports are available to all students for whom there is a determined need and a decision that's made by the teacher and staff working with that student in addition to the student, because we always want to make sure that we have the students' input on the additional tools and accommodations that they may have access to. So in regards to designated supports, they're tools available to all students with the determined need, and it doesn't exclude English learners. So certainly we have designated supports that are beneficial specifically to English learners, which is why we have a fully dedicated brochure for that subgroup. But if you notice on the slide, thank you for showcasing it, you'll see that under the designated supports, there are a lot of features that will help students that may have visual issues that perhaps don't constitute them as having a disability, but certainly features that will give them greater access. And that does include the text to speech or the translation, glossary, etc. So did I answer that question?
Yeah, that was great, Dee, I think, and I'm sure our person will weigh in, but we also encourage districts to create a process within the district to determine that, so that they're not just randomized each year. You need a process to establish what students are getting as designated supports and what qualifies them. Some districts may use things like SRBI to determine that, things like that.
And Janet, I'm just pointing out to the attendees here, this slide that's up, I think it's viewing here, that's rather busy, but a great way to summarize all the available accommodation, designated sports, and universal tools. So if you're kind of new to the game, I'm not sure, I can't see what slide number this is, but this is towards the beginning of the deck, and this is a great resource.
Yeah, it's our go-to. Janet and I have hard copies hanging in our office. I probably reference this accessibility chart on a daily basis. We even have one specific to the Connecticut SAT school day as we move towards digital testing. So I know there are a lot of questions, so please email us. You're welcome to give us a call, but definitely reach out to us and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have or provide you with the resources that you need.
So I'm gonna, Dee and Jan, I'm just looking at the time, 1:05. I know as Dee mentioned, we're compiling a Q&A that we'll probably put together, and look at that. We answered that question in the chart. So I think what we'll do is we'll call it a wrap for the afternoon. I appreciate the chat in the box because this has been the most spirited chat, I guess, saved for a Friday afternoon. So thanks for the conversation and everybody chiming in to answer. And we appreciate you taking the time. I know on your busy days and your partnership in accomplishing the state assessment. So I don't know, Dee and Jan, if you have anything to say to.
Yeah, just a huge thank you to all of your hard work and your collaboration and partnership. We appreciate your advocacy on behalf of your students, and it's always a pleasure to work with you. So know that we're here, we're available to assist you, and we wish you lots of luck in the weeks ahead. Jen, is there anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely, just echo Dee's sentiments, and as we said, we appreciate all of your efforts and your continuing support of all your kids. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.